So we're going to be starting with Ambassador Shahbaz Haji. But before, I just wanted to make one note. Our Zoom participant, John Fund, will be connecting in 20 minutes. So what I'd like to do, we'll just ask him to talk through about the debt ceiling and what's Washington. So, and then we'll be back to Europe after that. So if I could leave you to start.
I know we've been very focused on the U.S. in the first panel, which is a good thing. And what I wanted to do to start things off is just follow up from the Indiana example that we heard about, because we can always learn from positive examples, and Indiana was a good one, where essentially the state was bankrupt. And certainly in Europe, there was about a 3, perhaps 4-year interval of time when Greece was always in the headlines. Remember? Everybody was always saying, oh, those Greeks, they're bankrupt, hopeless. You remember? And now, do we hear about Greece? Well, obviously not, and why? They've got something right. They've done something right? Good news is no news. So things seem to be okay in Greece. So what happened? Well, I think 2 things happened very, very in a nutshell. One is they did the same thing that Indiana did. They took all this astronomical debt, over 200% of GDP, about 250%, and they spread it out over the future to give a chance for it to be repaid. That was the easy part. The harder part was to get the government to accept a lower standard of living for its citizens. Now, no government is willing to do that on its own. So, do you remember how many times Greece had an election, and a re-election, when the governments collapsed? Because Brussels was forcing the Greek governments to make it happen. Austerity. Nobody likes austerity. The Greeks didn't like to hear about it. But finally, after many, many years and attempts, and new elected parties always changing, finally, externally from Brussels, this is actually a positive example of what Brussels can do. So this is not Brussels bashing, which is so easy to do. But Brussels actually successfully got the government of Greece to lower salaries, lower wages in the public sector, in a significant way, 20%. Everybody accepted a 20% cut in salaries. And it's a combination of those 2 things that in the end settled. So now the longer term debt was all of a sudden, of course, with very, very low interest rates, was then sort of, the investors were confident that this was good bonds to be buying. So I just wanted to give you an example from Europe of a successful restructuring, but it could only be done with austerity.
How did they manage to get public sector to accept 20% wages? What was the environment in society at that time?
Well, there were riots. At first, when they tried, it was the same thing as in France. Right, that they're saying they want to increase the pension age limit, right? And there are riots in France, right? And so after many attempts, finally, it's just been rammed through in France. Well, the same thing in Greece. After many, many attempts, it was rammed through. Finally, people accepted grudgingly that this was going to happen, no matter what.
As part of that process, were they given alternate scenarios, like if you don't pass this, this is what's going to happen?
Well, it became very evident that funding wasn't going to come from the EU. There was no financing that was going to come. Money talks in the end, right? So Brussels said, well, if you don't accept, you're not going to get any money from the EU.
This would fall into the war category that I was talking about. The three sort of general: one is you either decide that you're going to get more healthy and you lose weight. Two is you go to war, or three, you find that other way. Brussels is an external threat, and you see nations go into something that looks like a more restrained period when they're under threat. I just would encourage us to be cautious about assuming that a benevolent dictator or another form of government or some super authority is what's required in order for us to find this kind of security. That comes from the outside often, but it doesn't necessarily have to be government.
Yeah, I agree. Just a few things on why I am not optimistic when it comes to the sustainability of debt that we are currently dealing with, especially in the Western world. We now have, if you look at the debt to revenue ratio, a global ratio of 260%. As far as I remember, a ratio above 180% means that the debt is likely not sustainable, and a ratio above 250 makes it very likely that the country will go bankrupt. Again, we have 260 now on a global average. And I think that just implies huge problems on the horizon. And if we then look at the other problems that are on the horizon, and there is pensions, for example, we have a population that is growing older all the time, and we have to finance their pensions. This goes also into the issue of explicit versus implicit debts, and the implicit debts are even much higher than what we are seeing normally on these statistics. We are dealing with problems in the social systems. We are also probably very soon you have to deal with problems in the banking sectors and also in the economy. And we are dealing with something that might be called imaginary problems, like, for example, the whole gender topic, where the government focuses on things just to make the public focus on other things that are the real problems. And if I then take a look at the approach that the government is taking, or that the governments are taking, and this is mostly just central economic planning, then I really don't believe that we will come out of the situation we are currently in, just because there are so many problems occurring at once without major inflation, and maybe even going into hyperinflation, for the simple reason that I don't see a solution, that is similar to what was done to Greece. I don't see that on the horizon. If there's so many countries impacted, if there's so many problems occurring at once, but I hope I'm wrong.
Peter, you had reference to the Greek debt restructuring. That was effectively a bilateral negotiation between Brussels and Athens, correct? And to the extent that we have the examples of the Paris Club back 40 years ago, which was more multilateral but still organized into one entity. What's, aside from the Eurozone countries, which by definition would have to be bilateral negotiations, what about the European countries that are not in the Eurozone?
Well, does anybody know why the Poland has a very different debt structure than Hungary? Do you remember? Well, after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, Poland agreed to have a debt reduction. Do you remember? And it was a conscious decision. They had at least half of their debt forgiven through a long series of negotiations. Not so long ago, 30 years ago. Hungary, on the other hand, didn't go down that route. Many of us reminisce about this, but didn't take advantage of that opportunity. And Hungary said, well, you know, we are proud that we are going to pay back all the money that we have borrowed. And that was a conscious decision. We wanted to be, we never wanted to actually default. Of course, Poland wasn't a default, it was an agreed reduction. But these are really difficult decisions, but it really has huge outcomes. So Poland is in a much better structural economic situation simply because half of their debt was let go.
I think there was some exchange there. You know, the idea of forgiveness of any debt is a very amusing thing to me. You might be forgiven by your parents or God, but it's unlikely you're going to be forgiven by government. There's some exchange that's occurring, and perhaps I'm certain if we were in Warsaw now, that there'd be a conversation about this, and it would pivot on a different series of exchanges that occurred. And so when you think about the notion of wanting to pay back your own debt, it certainly appears from the outside at least that Hungary was saying we will not be indebted in a different way, because you're not really forgiving a debt, you're simply exchanging one debt for another. And so I think about student loan forgiveness and all these debt forgivenesses, you're really only exchanging a debt for another. I'm not sure that I believe that a debt can be discharged unless it's somebody who says, I will absorb that debt for you with no exchange. And governments rarely do that. You exchange territories, you exchange security, you exchange future favors. In football, it's all exchange for a future draft pick. And so there's a calculation that goes there that is beyond the notion of taking free money.
So are you implying that sovereign debt issuance should become an asset-backed structure?
That's a big question, but I am inclined to say yes, I am.
Sort of what the Chinese are de facto doing.
That's what the Chinese are doing.
What is interesting is Brookings came out, I think within the last 6 months, with a review of the developing world debt situation, which is, according to them, running at $98 trillion. And 60% of them, according to the study, are countries that are unable to pay it back. Mm-hmm. So they're proposing a sort of Brady-like plan for the debt restructuring. And one of the things that's rather interesting and sort of pushes for this kind of thing, they said that, I'm looking at 27% of the debt of this 98 trillion is held in the private sector. But of that 27%, they're getting 37% of the debt service income, i.e. the coupon. The average coupon being 7.5%. So the idea of the Brady plan would be, look, accept, we're going to reissue new debt, it's going to have a lower coupon, it's going to allow the developing countries to actually be able to get off the ground, get their feet back on the ground, whatever the analogy is, and force the bondholders to take that kind of haircut. Does this work in Europe as well, or are we too much in the advanced nation category? And I'm talking more in the Balkans and east of well, let's be blunt, Ukraine when it starts to require its massive refinancing?
Hopefully, it will require it and will not be absorbed by Russia. Regardless, I think this is something that is doable for Europe. And I'm not sure that I would restrain it to the Balkans or elsewhere.
Or how about Indiana?
Yeah, of course. The exchange of debt is
Illinois.
it's exchanged for something else. And what people value, John, I'll tell you, with young managers in our company, they go to their employees and they're talking about, what do you need for money? How do I pay you more? And we try to educate them that money is only one element of what makes a person fulfilled. That perhaps they care about a title or where their desk is located or how much free time they have or what their hours of work are or the prestige in the job that they have or opportunities for upward mobility. And everyone values those things differently. And so when we think about the monetary system that we have right now of exchanging dollars throughout Europe, there are a whole variety of things that nations care about that are not just dollars or euros. And I know that as an ambassador, you had to spend a lot of time negotiating that. What is it that you really want? And I think about states, for example, in the upper Midwest, protection of water resources. We have the Great Lakes Compact, which is really about preserving water resources. As people are relocating around the nation, that water is increasing in value because now you've got a very high density in a place where you can't support them. There isn't enough water. And so that water resource becomes valuable. Debt would be forgiven in an instant for the right vote on that access to that water resource. And so there is a change, or there is a market for things. Debt is only one element. Economists, some of us tend to talk about that as the only element, and I think that's a mistake.
Just on the issue of forcing the bondholders to just take a loss. The issue always is you have to ask who are the bondholders, who is taking a loss? Because, for example, for many bonds, the people taking a loss are actually the pensioners, because pension funds hold huge amounts of bonds. So you just transfer a problem from one area to another. So I wouldn't be too optimistic when it comes to that.
Peter, I wanted to ask you, part of the pressure that came onto Greece for its austerity measures came from Germany. Germany today is in a different situation than it was, especially as it tries to disentangle from its over-reliance on, obviously, Russian energy, et cetera. So who among sort of the European community will be the one to put pressure for others to perhaps do austerity outside of Brussels, et cetera? Is there an emerging country that would do that?
I don't see it anywhere. Certainly, it was always Germany that was pushing austerity.
No jokes aside.
And I don't see France or any other. I mean, it could have been the UK, but obviously the UK is no longer part of the EU. But that UK is no longer in a position to be leading in any case. But no, I don't see any country leading that case certainly in the EU at the moment. In fact, they're quite happy that much less pressure. I mean, Italy, for example. I mean, the debt of Italy is huge. Maybe Scandinavia and Denmark, yeah, but they're relatively small, and so their potential to put on pressure is much more limited than Germany. But yes.
Peter, don't you think, though, when you talk about Italy, I mean, the whole world watches the spread between the Italian and the German debt markets as an indicator of stress and tension, and looks pretty good so far this calendar year versus the peak, which I think was 70 basis points higher than where it is right now that we saw last summer. So that mechanism seems to be fairly reliable, and I put it, the analogy is, well, shouldn't the state of Illinois pay more than the state of Minnesota? And there are no spreads that people are watching religiously, and it's not going to cause a political crisis if it widens out, is correct? So why should the ECB worry that if Italy goes profligate and the spread widens out to 2%, 3%, let the market decide and they'll buy it if it's of interest? Wouldn't that be the better alternative for the ECB to follow rather than the Mario Draghi will do what it takes?
Well, but in the U.S., the municipalities have different. When they issue a bond, then the interest rate that they will have to pay is different. It's not all the same. So it's the same thing in Europe. So I mean, Italy will have to pay a higher interest rate. But you know and because they all use the euro, so I mean the ECB will not be very happy if it becomes way out of whack, because then the euro itself will be perceived to be at a threat.
But it's a perception because there's no fiscal integration.
Yes. Well, the ECB then will say, well, whatever it takes, I will defend the euro, and then everything calms down.
There's another huge problem when we talk about spreads, and it's elementary math, and it goes like this. What is 2 minus 0? It is 2. What is 6 minus 4? It is still 2. So the moment ECB came out and said, oh, we're going to look for spreads not to widen, everyone realized that you can short all the bonds, not Italian bonds, because the spread, the defense of a spread is pointless, as I've just demonstrated. So what you can do is you can short all the bonds, have all the bonds go down, make money on all your short positions, and maintain the spread the same. That's one. Two, it is increasingly clear that European Central Bank has stopped being a monetary policy institution, and it has become a political institution, because Christine Lagarde didn't raise interest rates before French election, so she doesn't interfere with Macron's win. Just as she's not fighting inflation so aggressively now, because the French banks are basically supporting Italian debt because France needs a coalition with Italy against Germany. Now, how do I know all this? I know all this because what you just said, but when you talked about spread, you basically said this. If I short a German bond, a French bond, and an Italian bond, and if, or for people that don't short, if the bonds go down, Germany's goes the least, then French, and Italian bonds go the most. Well, when I've been trading those for last year, there's a huge differential of not going down. So you have Germany's going down a lot more than French, and Italian not going down enough, which means someone is artificially supporting them and getting into the market whenever there's a stress scenario, which basically suits all the speculative traders like me, because we want the interest rates to go up, but spreads not to widen, meaning 2 minus 0 is still 2, 6% minus 4% is still 2. And that's why the spreads have been so narrow, and that's why you're seeing everything being so nice. And what you saw, what is especially worrying about the state of European debt is when there was a banking crisis, which wasn't a crisis, with the Silicon Valley Bank and all that, the derivatives market, the futures market, they went ballistic, and the interest rates went really down. But if you look at the cash auctions, when the people actually give money to the government, those interest rates didn't go down that much and rebounded immediately back up, which means that people who actually give cash to the government say, well, you're looking good, but not that good looking.
Thank you. I would like to make some comments about what talk about, because in one of my previous slides, I talk about the central banks mistakes also. But I'm focused on the European economy and the European Central Bank. Well, at the European Union, there is a European Central Bank which is entitled to deal with the euro, in fact, the level of prices, but there is no a common fiscal policy, and I hope they will never have, because any member state can introduce all the taxes they want. So this is the contradiction and why it's happening a very stupid situation. For instance, I can tell you in Spain, a long line of people buying treasury bonds. And well, a government is increasing debt continuously. Up to now, it was the European Central Bank which was financing the Spanish debt because they bought all these kind of bonds. Not only government, also private one, but mainly the government bonds. And aside from that, I will say that in Spain, I refer to Spain because, well, I know very well these cases, and maybe in other member states it's happened the same, but do you know how municipalities funded their budgets? Selling urban land. So can you imagine how it affects the market economy? So housing market, and so it's a very stupid situation that is contradictory with the elementary laws in economics. But nothing happens until the European Central Bank stopped this policy. It's a great mistake. So, and it will affect also some important corporations that they will move abroad. I don't mean to the Bahamas or to any other country with a very fiscal policy, advantageous fiscal policy. No, just to another European Union member state. It's the case now. You are very familiar with a huge corporation, Ferrovial, which is working in the United States, in Australia, in a lot of public works. Wow, it's the government of the socialist government. They criticize all the time, and even they menace their responsible from the corporation if they transfer their activities to Amsterdam. So this is a connection. There is a connection, and the European Union don't make just a word. But in the treaties, according to the treaties, they can do it. There is one of the principles, the movement of capitals, people, and corporation. You can operate in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, anywhere. Is allowed. But the Spanish government tried to impeach this situation, and the European Commission is doing nothing.
Thank you. I think we have John Fund on. Could someone tell me if that's true? Can we put him up? John, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much.
Great. You're perfect timing because we're in the middle of the discussion on global debt, and we've been waiting for you to give us a lowdown on the debt ceiling impasse, what's happening, what we expect. So I'll pass it on to you.
Well, first of all, President Biden's position is a purely political one. He believes that he can muscle the Republican House and the minority Republicans in the Senate to passing a debt limit extension with no negotiations and no compromise. That is a smart political strategy in the short term. In the long term, though, I think he probably is going to regret that. And certainly in terms of credibility for the United States and trust in our political system, it's a mistake because we are living in perilous times in the U.S. Kevin Hassett, who was President Trump's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, is now agreeing with many other economists that we are on the brink of a recession, driven in part by the fact that the federal budget is now having enormous interest payments due to the higher interest rates dictated by the Federal Reserve. In addition, we have some brand new numbers from the monthly report of the Congressional Budget Office. Listen to this. The U.S. budget deficit for the first half of fiscal year 2023 has already reached $1.1 trillion in under 6 months. To give that in context, that's almost as much as the entire fiscal deficit in the previous fiscal year, which was 12 months. So we're running about twice as fast in terms of piling up debt as we were. In addition, Federal Reserve Board member Larry Lindsey predicts the deficit this year will come in finally at $1.8 trillion. That's 7% of our gross domestic product. That no longer puts us in anything in the historical context of the United States, except for during World War II. It approaches the kind of profligate debt burden that Greece and Italy and places like that have piled up over the years. It is a risk to our long-term stability, certainly a risk to our medium-term prosperity, and I think a risk ultimately to any kind of solution to our federal spending problems. So I believe in the next 24 to 48 hours, the House of Representatives is going to cast a very important vote on a Republican alternative to a debt ceiling bill that doesn't have any constraints, and that would be a package of spending cuts, spending restraint, and fiscal reforms. It's going to be very close because almost no Democrats will support it, and the Republicans, as you know, only have a 5-seat majority in the House of Representatives. The Congressional Budget Office scores on that bill will come out this afternoon, Washington time. There will be debate tonight and probably tomorrow, then there will probably be a vote tomorrow. If it passes, then the measure moves over to the Senate, which will not approve it, but will probably pass something that restrains federal spending or at least forces President Biden to the table. I doubt that President Biden would veto any measure, even if it were watered down. I doubt that President Biden would veto any measure, especially if it was watered down from the House version. As a result, I think you're going to see a resolution if the Republican House bill passes today, tomorrow, or Thursday. I think you'll see a resolution of the debt crisis limit that will restore some U.S. credibility. If the Republicans can't hold together and pass a debt services bill on their own, then I think we're into a potential chaos situation in which Biden does have the upper hand. So a lot is riding on this in the next 48 hours.
John, if it doesn't pass, what are we looking at? Pushing the ball to September, or there's some talk of next year, right before the elections?
Well, Treasury economists admit that there are all kinds of measures that they can use that they don't publicly talk about. So you probably would kick the can down the road several weeks or several months, and the Republicans would go back to the drawing board and try to come up with something that would be palatable and could pass their entire caucus. I would say the odds slightly favor the Republicans passing the bill this week and then transferring the debate over to the Senate. But I think a lot of this is kabuki theater. Everybody knows that in the end there will be a debt limit increase. The question is, what are the politics of it? And the question is, who gets the blame in the debate, even if they do pass it, for delaying it?
If anybody has an extra room, I might want to stay here for a while, because I think with what John said, I don't think I want to go home the next couple of days. So just let me know. And I wash dishes very well.
If it passes, come home. the skies will brighten and people will actually be talking about real issues then.
Goldman Sachs came out recently and said that they didn't think the tax revenues were going to be so strong based on last year's capital gains tax that probably brings in less revenue. But we won't know, or at least we haven't read here what it is, and hopefully by the end of the month we should know the strength of the tax season. Would there be any substantive impact on from a policy standpoint of how the Republicans, I guess in this case, will try to pass something that will improve the deficit?
How would they improve the deficit? By tax increases or by spending cuts?
That's my question. Are they afraid of the tax increases in every sector?
They're not afraid of it. It's just not on the table. I would remind everyone in the room that, look, I have been very critical of the Republican Party and certainly congressional Republicans, but I will say this in their defense. Since 1990, which is 33 years ago, and since Grover Norquist from the Americans for Tax Reform put forth his famous pledge that Republican candidates had to sign or were pressured to sign to oppose tax increases, not a single House Republican or Senate Republican has ever voted for a tax increase, a general tax increase. Might have voted for a fee here or there, but not a tax increase in 33 years. They would be torn to shreds by their primary voters should some of them break and vote for a tax increase. So that's not going to happen. The only question that's holding up the House Republican debt limit bill is whether or not cutting back some of the green energy tax credits counts as a tax increase. I don't think it does because, frankly, those are really subsidies but in disguise. So tax increases are and should be off the table. As to why the revenue is falling, there are many factors, some of which you identified. But one of the most important is this. The enormous tsunami of COVID relief money has finally worked its way through the economy. The last payments have been made, and that money, that spigot is being turned off. So as a result, you're getting less revenue because a lot of that money, of course, ultimately some people did pay taxes on portions of it. So I believe that what we're seeing, though, in large part, is the slowing down of the economy. A lot of the new jobs that have been created, and a lot of jobs have been created, are called MIC jobs. In other words, these are jobs that don't pay a lot of money, that are maybe 20 hours a week versus 40 hours a week, and sometimes people stack them. They have one or two or three of those jobs. A lot of people are still not in the workforce because, of course, of all the COVID payments, and some people, of course, have long COVID and have a medical reason. So we do not have a favorable employment picture, despite what the numbers say. That indicates that we're going to have a weaker economy than many of us think, or the official statistics say. And as I began, it looks as if we're heading into a recession. I don't think it will be a long recession or a deep recession, but it will hit, and it will also impact President Biden's reelection contest, which of course he announced this morning. And I believe that Biden is not a sure thing to be the Democratic nominee, just as Donald Trump is not by any means a sure thing to be the Republican nominee. As we know, less than 10% of voters look forward to another race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. There's a lot of market failure in this current field, and I believe that the voters will be addressing that in the primaries.
Just a quick thing. You remember what I said about the debt to revenue ratio before? I just made a quick calculation with the numbers that John mentioned. If I'm not completely mistaken, that would mean that the debt to revenue ratio for the US is currently at 300, in excess of 370%. I mentioned before that a few years back, above 250% meant that you are very likely to be bankrupt in a few years. So let's see how it works out.
Yeah.
Well, not only are you probably correct, our Social Security system is scheduled to run out of money in 7 years, and our Medicare system which is as large. It's the system for providing for health care for anyone over age 65 is scheduled to exhaust its resources in 6 years. So those are the two largest single elements of our federal budget, and they're exactly on track to run dry.
John, what do you think the pressure is going to be if we do see the recession upon the Federal Reserve to lower rates? Because at the moment, their intention is to keep rates, I mean, we'll see what they do next week, but the intention is to keep the rates longer at the same level. What kind of pressure do you think we'll see on them if the recession comes?
I don't think the recession is going to be deep enough or long enough for them to want to lower rates. I think they will pause any further increases in interest rates. But, you know, inflation is being stubborn, not only in the United States, but in other countries, such as in Europe. And I think this once again should teach all of us a painful lesson that we hadn't learned or we had forgotten over the last 40 years, which is you never let the inflation genie out of the bottle, because it is always more persistent than you think and always more resistant to the antibiotics of central banking than people believe or wish.
John, here's a question for you. Good to see you, by the way.
Pleasure, John.
The entire San Francisco Bay Area got a six-month...
Don't make me cry, please.
got a 6-month reprieve on paying both federal and state taxes. So our tax, even though we can file if we want to, we don't have to until October 16th. We don't have to make the payments until for 6 months after the original date, which comes to October 16th.
John, pardon me for asking, who decided this and why?
Well, that was my question for you. Where did this gift come from? And was this, negotiated between Gavin Newsom and President Biden, perhaps, or the IRS? Or
this is the
do you
first
have any
I've heard
insights?
of it. This is the first I've heard of it. I will say something that almost never, no one in Washington ever says. I don't know.
The purported reason is because of the snows and storms that the Bay Area suffered. But the reprieve applies to everybody, whether they were affected by the storms and snows or not. Anyway, thought you...
It sounds like a Gavin Newsom gimmick. I just don't know the details of what in the world he's doing.
John, can we take advantage of you on a couple of topics? One, talk to us about the primary, the potential candidates, and then if we could pivot over to China, because those are of interest to the European audience here.
Which primaries?
Both.
Well, look, I'll go out on a limb and say, I would say, and this goes against the conventional wisdom, the odds are that neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden will be their party's nominee in 2024. Now, I know what the conventional wisdom says, but the conventional wisdom is not aware of some developments behind the scenes. First of all, with President Trump, he will be indicted again. It will be more serious than the first indictment, which was a joke, but not as serious as this third indictment, which will be over classified documents, withholding them and keeping them against federal law. That's a very serious indictment because he's basically confessed to it already. His defense is that he can declassify anything simply by thinking about declassifying it. That will go down in history as the equivalent of Bill Clinton's famous saying, it all depends on what the word is, and it won't hold water. In addition, even if you can declassify by simply imagining that you want to declassify, it doesn't mean you can take the physical documents with you down to your retirement home and keep them in a storage shed. Now, of course, there's a lot of hypocrisy in that. We've already seen that Joe Biden and others also kept classified documents after they left office. But the double standard only counts so long as someone isn't indicted. If they're indicted, you have to look at the case in front of you, not the case of similarly situated people. I believe that will create a problem for President Trump in the following sense. There is a significant percentage of his electorate who loves Donald Trump and wants Donald Trump to be president, but they also look at all of the polls, or will look at all of the polls, that show Trump trails Joe Biden in a tentative match to president by about 3 points or more, and any other Republican of substance leads Joe Biden by 3 or 4 points, including Ron DeSantis. And I think in the end, the electability issue will play a role. There will be pro-Trump voters who will simply decide it is not worth the risk of nominating Donald Trump, especially with all of these indictments hanging over him and not resolved, and expecting that he can win a general election, especially a general election against a Democrat we probably don't know the name of yet. I do not believe that Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee for president. I say that for several reasons, and I'll be brief. Democrats privately know what CNN calls an enormous gamble that they're taking. They're taking a gamble on a person who was barely seen, who announced by video at 4 a.m. this morning, won't take questions, has not held a press conference for months, probably can't have a press conference right now, and is of uncertain condition. In addition, if he runs and wins, he will be 86 years old. It's too risky for Democrats to put those chips on the table. So I believe there's a second problem that Joe Biden has. The House Republican Oversight Committee has been demanding documents from the Biden Treasury Department for several months regarding financial transfers between certain countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America, and Biden family members. The Treasury Department refused to turn them over for months. Suddenly, about 2 weeks ago, the Treasury Department said it reinterpreted its rules and it turned over most of the records with promises of more to come. Those records have been examined by the House Republican Oversight Committee, and what they find is that there are suspicious transfers in the dozens of occasions between various foreign countries and 9 Biden family members. I repeat, 9, N-I-N-E. And it could go up to 12 when the final documents come in. These are transfers in large sums of money from companies or entities in China, Ukraine, certain African republics, Brazil, other places. I believe this is the beginning of a long series of stories that will show that the Hunter Biden story and his laptop are only the tip of an iceberg. The Biden family is compromised by foreign payments, many of them during his vice presidency, but some during his presidency. And I believe that in the end, the Democrats are going to not block the Hunter Biden or the Biden family probes as much as they might previously have, because they will provide a convenient avenue to say that the burden on Joe Biden is so great and his age problems being so uncertain that they have to look for a new candidate. Now, the reason why this will be a long, drawn-out process is very simple. There's a famous saying in the movie, the famous line in the song in the movie Sound of Music. What do you do about a problem named Maria? Well, in political terms, it's in the Democratic Party, it's what do you do about a problem named Kamala? Joe Biden does not believe that she can win election for president in her own right as vice president. Democrats don't believe that she is prepared to be president. I think that in some ways she has been treated unfairly and not been given responsibility which would allow her to improve her image. But the bottom line is Democrats do not want to nominate Kamala Harris. However, they have a problem. She is a threefer. She is black, she is of Asian extraction, and Indian Americans are the richest ethnic group in America and would take umbrage at her being sidelined, and she is a woman. So it's extremely difficult to dislodge her. So what do you do? I would say an implausible but increasingly likely scenario is this. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor is in her 70s. I think she's 73 or 74. She's clearly ill, has serious diabetes. We have seen retirements recently. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer retiring rather suddenly. I think it's entirely possible that Sonia Sotomayor would retire in the next few months, and Joe Biden could nominate Kamala Harris to be a Supreme Court Justice. That would be at least a horizontal transfer in terms of status. It would put Kamala Harris, who's a solid liberal vote on the Supreme Court, and it would mean that the vice president would not be running for president, and the Democratic primary field would be wide open. It would probably be filled with Gavin Newsom of California, Pete Buttigieg, who's the transportation secretary, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, and several other people. So you'd have a wide open race there.
John, for the European audience, if Kamala Harris were to go to the Supreme Court prior to next year, would the replacement be something that required House or Senate approval, or would it be up to the president?
It would require approval by both the House and the Senate. I suspect that what Biden would do in order not to unduly influence any Democratic presidential nomination fight would be to appoint a vice president on an interim basis. In other words, someone who would fill the job for a year or so, but probably agree not to run as a presidential candidate. Or if Biden wanted to weigh in, I suspect that he would probably pick Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan as his vice president, because that's who smart and savvy Democrats want to be the Democratic nominee.
Interesting. Could you also, for the European audience, pivot to China? Because it's key relations for Europe, but it has certain biases from the standpoint of the Americans, how Europe should interact with with China, excuse me. Could you give us some of your thoughts?
Can you be a little more specific?
Well, the United States is pulling Europe to its side regarding a number of issues. Ukraine and its relations with China. Brussels has its own force pulling away from China, as we've seen recently, but that doesn't mean that all of Europe is in agreement. And the US is clearly on the side of Brussels, trying to push all of Europe towards the direction of that meets the US approach. Is that something that's even talked about in Washington, or is it all just bilateral US-China?
Well, I think the Americans were pleased that most European governments, either privately or publicly, and certainly the European Union, slapped down Emmanuel Macron after his stunts in China. I would have to say, I've seen the videos that Macron released to celebrate his trip to China, and they were truly disgraceful, featuring him reviewing military parades and the shock troops of the Chinese army that would invade Taiwan if ever such an event happened. So I think Macron has been put in his cage for a little bit, rhetorically, for a while. And I think Europe realizes that despite the volume of trade they have with China, China's economy is weakening. If the US economy is weakening, the Chinese economy is also weakening. The best analysts I look at in China remind me, there are two things about China that you have to always remember. Their economic statistics are not the most reliable in the world. They should be looked at with a somewhat jaundiced view. For example, they managed to hide through creative accounting their property, their real estate property meltdown for quite some time. And the second thing you have to remember is they lie to each other. This is how COVID happened. Every level of the Chinese government lies to the next level up or even down. And that's how COVID happened. The Wuhan lab hid the full consequences of the Wuhan crisis from Beijing for months. When it was finally revealed, the Chinese Politburo panicked, and of course they initiated the lockdown. And the lockdown was imitated by many of the Europeans, and it led to shall we say, not a good outcome. I refer you to the recent numbers about the level of excess deaths in Europe over the last 3 years. We now have the numbers in. We can pretty much say that the lockdown was not helpful because if you look at all of the European countries, both in terms of COVID deaths and excess deaths that have developed largely through COVID, that would mean depression, suicide, heart attacks, cancer treatments that weren't conducted, appointments missed, various other things. Guess who's at the bottom of the heap in Europe? Sweden. They were right after all, and the fact that you haven't heard about it means how right they are. Everyone is embarrassed. Sweden was right. Now, as for China, I think the Chinese are not going to invade Taiwan. I think the Chinese want to intimidate and bully Taiwan, and we have to stand up against that. I do believe that the United States, regardless of who is president, are going to be giving Taiwan far more ability to defend themselves in the future than they have now. I think the Chinese will take note of that, and I think the situation will probably be kicked over to the next president for resolution, but there's not going to be any imminent Chinese invasion or takeover of Taiwan.
Hi, Nevin Vidakovic here. I'm from the audience. Two questions which are basically one and the same. If we look at China's recent activity, they've managed to establish themselves quite fast as a power broker. I mean, they've set up negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. All of a sudden, these two countries are normalizing their relationship. That kind of stuff increases their status. So what do you think about that kind of behavior of China? And in a sub-context, as a sub-question, is something like that possible with Taiwan, where they start talking to each other, then they start to normalize their relationship, and then they say, well, after all, we're one people, and then 5 years from now, Taiwan says we're willing to negotiate some kind of a Hong Kong-like deal.
Well, we all know how well that worked for Hong Kong, didn't we? China signed a treaty with Hong Kong, about Hong Kong, I should say. China signed a treaty in 1997, and it was going to run for 50 years. How'd that work out for them? Not very well. The Chinese can't be trusted. Go to any Asian government, including the Vietnamese, and ask them, do they trust China? Do they trust their word on anything? Even the Philippines, which the Chinese were spending enormous amounts of money to bribe officials in and invest in, even the Philippines have stepped back from cozying up to China. So I believe that China has all kinds of demonstration projects around the world to try to build status. Belt and Road Initiative, that's not working out well for them in many countries. I could be wrong, but I would be surprised if the Saudis and the Iranians actually trusted each other enough to come to a real agreement as opposed to just sitting around a table and talking. I would also be surprised if the Chinese had any influence in the Ukrainian conflict in the end. I think right now they're just being meddlesome suppliers of key equipment to the Russians, and the Chinese are very wary of overreacting on Taiwan because they saw how much the Russians overestimated their military prowess in attacking Ukraine. So I believe that China is knocking on every door in the global neighborhood, hoping to see if one is unlocked. Sometimes they find one that's unlocked, but increasingly, as the Chinese continue to operate in a very opportunistic fashion, recently they just this week they had to slap down their ambassador in Paris, who claimed that the Baltic states and other former Soviet republics weren't truly sovereign or independent. That's the real China. And even though the Chinese central government repudiated that ambassador's statement, it was heard and it was noted in governments all over the world.
John, we're going to be pivoting to this narrative that I don't know if it originated in the US or in Europe, but mainstream media is picking it up left and right. In fact, I think that might have been Tucker Carlson's last topic on Fox News, the de-dollarization. Where is that narrative coming from in the US?
Well, I don't know enough about this to comment in detail. I think there are people on the panel who know more than I do. I will simply say this. The Russian efforts in Bolivia and Brazil and other places are resource-based. Bolivia has a lot of lithium, so the Russians, like the Chinese, are very interested in exploiting or making arrangements with leftist governments in South America to have greater access to earth minerals and lithium and other such things. I think it's a large leap, though, between saying that you want to have an alternative to the dollar in international exchange and actually having one. I debated a Russian official on Arab television last week and specifically told him, we all know why you're doing this because you claim that the West is conducting economic warfare on Russia. Well, the reason it's conducting sanctions on Russia is because Russia invaded Ukraine. And the way to have a stable international trading system or to have a genuine alternative to that system develop peacefully is to have a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. And of course, he had nothing to say on that. So all of this talk is linked ultimately to last year's decision by Russia to break an international treaty, the Treaty of Budapest, where you're sitting. Everybody remembers that in 1996, the Russian Federation, along with the Western powers, signed an agreement that basically legitimized and entrenched the boundaries of Ukraine. And the Russians broke that last year, as they did before with Crimea, and invaded. And the de-dollarization efforts that they make are interesting. Good try, but I think they're ultimately going to fail. The dollar will gradually lose strength over time, but it's a long time, not a short period of time.
John, it's good to see you, by the way. It was more fun when we were together here in Budapest, but virtually is a good backup.
Next year.
Next year. It's interesting because as someone who negotiates and deals, and John Chisholm, you could comment on this as well, a lot of times you throw out all sorts of things as a smokescreen for some of the things you're really working on. Because China's not just talking about changing the dollar, they're also talking about changing internet protocols. They're talking about changing the size and carriage of exchange on ships, of cargo ships. There are a whole variety of other things that they're working on with the idea that people will fatigue and say, okay, you can have that, but we're keeping this. And that strikes me as what the Chinese government may be up to here. I agree with your take very much, John Fund, that they're not looking to take over on the financial markets, at least yet. But there are other things that they're serious about. So many of them are in the technology space that they may prefer to grasp first, with the idea that many Americans and others will simply say, well, we kept the dollar, and that's what we really care about.
Yeah,
I agree. That's a good analysis.
I think we have to separate between the dollar as a reserve currency, the concept of deglobalization, because the dollar is a reserve currency, and people tend to forget this. The reserve currency is not the US dollar that's inside the US borders. It's the dollars that are outside of the United States, in the so-called euro dollar system, which, by the way, has nothing to do with the euro currency. And one of the things that we have seen over the several decades is a buildup of huge euro dollar borrowings by, Brazil, Peru, Thailand, you name it, all the countries around the world. And that totals $12 trillion today. So for the US dollar to lose its reserve status, you first have to see that deleveraged. And in an environment where we have, according to Rubini, $400 trillion of global debt, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen overnight. So I agree with John. I would like to ask about this, the concept of deglobalization in Europe in particular, because Christine Lagarde of the ECB was just speaking yesterday about fragmentation. The trend of deglobalization will mean different supply chains and so forth, which she cited as one of the reasons for potential inflationary effects, and hence the argument for maintaining tightening monetary policy. Some of you want to talk about this?
An idea I recently heard from a Stanford professor that I really don't like. I like the professor, I don't like the idea, to be very clear, an economics professor, is that supply chains are becoming so precious and sensitive that we have to document, monitor, track, and manage them. Well, I can't think, having been in the business world, as many of us have here for years, I can't think of anything, any concept, any structure more ephemeral than a supply chain. They're constantly shifting, changing, evolving. If this product has a slightly better feature set, you may shift on a moment's notice to use that one. If you run out of this one's not available, the price goes up, this one's available on a slower, you may choose a completely different supply path. To try to document, manage that, I can't think of anything that would make the global supply chain more brittle and fragile than to try to manage and control it and even document it. So the best thing we can do is allow people all over the world the freedom to negotiate, to deal, truck and barter, to use Adam Smith's words, with whomever, so that that can stay as supple and resilient as possible. That global
the problem there with what you're saying is that ideally that's true, but we have led by the United States, we have created a block of US aligned nations and non-US aligned nations, which are going down a separate path. John, do you think in Washington that that's something that's almost here to stay?
You mean the continued de-alignment of nations outside of the OECD?
Yeah. I mean, I think code word is it's China, right? Because the non-US aligned group is really led by China, less by Russia, which is not as relevant.
Well, you know, it's a cliche to say always look at India, and it's sometimes difficult because India does not speak with one voice always, and of course it's a chaotic democratic nation. But India is going to surpass China, as you know, in population in a few years. India's economy is not robust as robust as China's during its growth period was, but China is slowing down in its growth. So I believe that what you're going to see is, yes, there's going to be a de-aligned movement, but it's increasingly going to feature tensions and competition between India and China. So rather than a tripolar world where you have Europe, the United States, China, India will increasingly assert itself and muscle in and have a seat at the table.
Let's go back a little bit in time. We in Europe, at least, for many, many years already, were working on a deindustrialization in Europe. And I think the same applies to a lesser degree to the US. And now we have the situation that we want to sanction Russia and are essentially standing with a knife in a shooting. We are not equipped to sanction Russia. Now we are thinking about sanctioning, in some cases, maybe even China. We are not equipped to do that because of the decisions we took in the last 20, 30, 40 years, which led to a deindustrialization in the Western world. And this is actually also, because you mentioned Lagarde earlier, this is of course where the inflationary pressure also comes from. Because if you sanction other countries, their products will be more expensive, and we profited to an immense amount from cheap products from China and from other Asian countries mostly, that our inflation was much, much lower than actually the money printing we did would imply. So yeah, we are now earning what we actually, the issues are coming back to bite us.
In our dealings with foreign trade, I feel like we very often, we the United States, use a sledgehammer when we should be using a scalpel. And with China in particular, there's so many dimensions to our relationship with China. And yet, what do we hear about most of the relationship? We hear about Taiwan, we hear about the Uyghurs, the growing power of and authoritarianism of Xi Jinping. There are millions of relations and transactions that are done every day still with China. These are good. These are healthy. It seems to me we need to quit using a sledgehammer and say, this is what is good about China, about our relationship with them, and this is what we don't like. And use some Dale Carnegie. Remember How to Win Friends and Influence People? Show appreciation, do it sincerely, don't criticize, don't complain. If you make a mistake, admit it quickly and emphatically. I could go on and on. I'm a great fan of Dale Carnegie. And those principles are applicable in any situation with another person, with a group, with employees, and with other countries. And it seems to me we're not using them like we could be.
It's interesting. I was walking around this city today, and on other experience or other times that I've been fortunate enough to be here, and there's a spectacular collection of public art. Various military leaders and others on high pedestals and plinths throughout the city, and every a bit of carved-in building there's a statue that represents some important bit of history that's relevant to the people that live here and really to all of us as human beings. But this particular visit, after being absent for the pandemic period and others, I was struck by how many of those would remain standing in the United States today. How many of these people were perfect enough to succeed in this lens of criticism? And so, John, I think what you're saying is precisely correct, which is China's no better nor no worse than any other human. They're humans. But on the opposite side of that, we need to identify where that we have strengths with them and where our weaknesses lie, and fortify against the weaknesses and capitalize on the strengths. This is sort of basic human interaction. And it's interesting to me how Marcon or anyone else, they seem to fly to the extreme position and run from the less so. I have significant concerns about a number of our competitors in business and other places, but rarely can I vilify them wholly. There's something that they're doing right. And the reason that they're a threat to us is because there's some decision or some action that they've taken that is superior to the actions that I've taken in my own choices. And it strikes me now that Europe especially might learn a bit about what is it exactly that China's attempting to do, how do they fit that into some sort of a shifting world order. Absolutely, India is rising. I'm frustrated by my own government that we don't spend more time and energy in locking arms with that particular nation, where we have natural and many overlapping interests. Europe would be, I think, mistaken to lean too hard into China, but likewise too far away from them. How do we talk about the things that we need to do together, meaning the West generally, perhaps including India and parts of Africa in the West, without vilifying Russia or anyone else?
If I could just speak up, of course I agree with John and Terry that we want peaceful relations with our competitors, and we want to speak softly while at the same time having a stick in the closet. But let me just make an obvious statement. Our argument is always with the governments of these authoritarian competitors, not with their people. Remember, authoritarian governments want us to only deal with them. They want to claim that they represent the spirit of the state, of the nation, and that the people are simply monolithically behind them. I would remind you, and this is from The Economist magazine very recently, that almost every day in China, there are between 50 and 100 mass protests, riots, demonstrations of some kind or another, whether it's against eminent domain policies or COVID policies or basically government corruption. And a lot of these break into violence. Building disputes, school disputes, land rights, fuel withdrawal freezes, corruption, state violence, pay and benefits, delayed housing projects, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. The Chinese people are not living in a country of great social rest. There's great social unrest. There's a lot of unhappiness in China. And the Chinese people are not allowed to express this, partly because of the great firewall on the internet and other things. But we can do both. We can have negotiations that are sensible and productive with the governments of authoritarian regimes, including powerful ones like China. At the same time, we remind ourselves they do not represent their people. We often don't know what their people think, and their people are often extremely upset with their government, but they're not allowed to express it in the conventional terms that we in the West understand.
A little data point to emphasize what Terry just said. Largest U.S. diplomatic presence in any country in terms of physical compound and number of U.S. State Department employees is India. So the diplomatic corps understands what you're saying. I'm not sure the economic corps always does, but.
I think it's also the largest subsidiary of Goldman Sachs in India as well.
It's unorthodox, John, I apologize, but I'd like to ask a question of our Europeans. I'm imagining, I was inspired by what John Funn said. I think he was describing the state of Michigan during lockdown, not necessarily China. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but that's the way I heard what you were saying. And so I'm inspired to ask the question about, would Brussels be a different enterprise if it had this national election for a president or a leader of the kind of authority that the U.S. president has? You know, George Washington imagined himself to be a magistrate, and that's how he referred to himself routinely. That's how he exited with 250 words or something when he left office. By the time we got to Barack Obama, it's like, you know, you watch the Singing in the Rain, and it says the end, there are 4 names, it's over. You watch the John Wick 4, it's 8 minutes of you know, diamond point font to get to all the people that were involved in this. And so I'm wondering, now that the U.S. presidency is so powerful, does Europe aspire to have that kind of central authority? And does it require that leader of a bureaucratic state, or can a hydra really accomplish it?
Well, that's an excellent question, and there's no one answer. It's completely scattered. So you have on the one extreme a Hungarian or Polish government, which says, well, you know, leave us alone, and we think that Europe will be strong if the individual countries, sovereign countries, part of the EU will be strong. And quite frankly, certainly I could tell you from the Hungarian side, anyone who is sent to the European Parliament is actually a little bit ridiculed. So there are elections, of course, but they are sent to Brussels and they're forgotten. So it doesn't feel like they're going to represent the Hungarian people in Brussels at all. Now, of course, if you ask Germany or France, I'm sure you get a very different story, or Belgium or Holland.
Well, I would like to table a question, but it's quite different to the point of view you are talking about now. It's about because in Europe we have a different opinion about what is the position in the United States about the Agenda 2030. Well, I think that we are very much concerned on that in the United States. You know that the Rio de Janeiro group is starting, but in fact it was the United Nations agenda and followed very close to by the European Union institutions. So what about the impact of the green economies and all these topics that, all media are talking every day in different countries in Europe? What is the opinion? What is your point of view?
If I could interject, we have a half an hour, and we wanted Peter to do a Hungary perspective, et cetera, but I assume 30 minutes is not as necessary. So I would like to have just one topic that I believe next year will be even more of a topic, and that is the development of artificial intelligence, and with specific reference to this ChatGPT. And the Californians would be, I suppose, the best to start here.
Wow. How many people here have used ChatGPT? Okay, all of us. How many people find it exciting, thrilling, scary? Many distinguished scientists and innovators have signed a letter saying that development on new AIs more powerful than GPT-4, which is the foundational one of ChatGPT, should be paused for 6 months while the various development teams have a chance to collaborate and discuss how best to align, that is, to human goals, these AIs. People are aware of that, I presume. Raise your hand if you're aware of this letter that has been signed by, I understand, 26,000 people now, and they include such luminaries as, Max Tegmark, a professor at MIT of computer science, Elon Musk, Eliezer Yudkowsky, the head or the chief scientist at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. I could go on and on. So what are they worried about? The fact, first of all, the fact that so many really thoughtful and really smart scientists have signed this certainly gets my attention, and even gives me pause a bit to wanted to try to understand what their concern is. It is that at some point, superintelligence will become so intelligent, it'll have a mind of its own and its objectives of its own, and could do things that are completely counter to what we humans want them to do. The big question in computer science circles is which is progressing more rapidly, the advance of the superintelligence or the advance of the alignment techniques that are basically our way of controlling this. This model is not universal. There's some highly regarded computer scientists like Monica Anderson who don't buy the alignment approach and don't think it's relevant. Well, what's the best way to resolve this issue? Well, first of all, if you look at previous technologies, fire, aviation, computers, the internet, mobile devices, and so forth, is there anyone that pausing for 6 months would have done any good or made any difference? And the answer is, I don't think so. I can't think of any. It's possible that some powerful big man, in caveman times might have wanted to have singular control of fire and therefore didn't want other people to have access to it. But that wasn't likely to be effective, and it certainly wouldn't have done humanity any good. So there's that. If those who are signing this have to feel that artificial intelligence is fundamentally different than any technology that's come before in its potential to negatively affect humanity. And then there's the whole question of who's responsible if there is a problem, if an AI kills people or hurts people. Is it the AI or is it the people who developed it? And then a third important question is China or other powers that are any rogue power. Even if the leading laboratories like Google, Facebook, OpenAI, and Meta, and others agreed to a pause for 6 months, China certainly isn't going to do that. So what's the resolution? Let me suggest this. Common law, tort law, in which we wait until someone is injured. Now, the pushback on this idea is that, maybe the first injury would be very large scale. Well, that seems highly improbable to me. It seems to me the first injuries will be relatively small scale. And so, great, that's an opportunity for a court of law or a jury to weigh in on what our society considers fair and reasonable resolution. The reasonable man or woman or person is, what would a reasonable person consider a reasonable resolution in this situation? Who's responsible? There are plenty of precedents. Take dangerous animal laws. Those have been on the books for centuries. If you own a dangerous animal and it hurts or injures somebody, you're responsible. It could be the same way, using an analogy like that a judge or jury would use existing law to decide who's responsible in this case. So, and let several such cases, multiple such cases emerge so that we can see, hopefully, a pattern, a theme, which would inform what our laws should be. You know, do we even need a regulation? Well, probably there'll be, people will want the clarity that a regulation provides. They will demand it, I suspect. And so, but having this kind of real world experience to inform a law or regulation is the best way for us to figure out how to regulate AIs, in my view. And it's the same way we regulate anything that has, ideally, that has potential danger in it, like an automobile or a drone or an airplane. It's just, our immediate impulse is always to write a regulation rather than say, okay, let's see what a series of courts of law and judges or juries would decide is the most reasonable case, have lots of real world cases and learn from that and let that inform the case. One more thing, and that is early on, especially early on in the development of a new technology like AI, the risks are much more visible and readily comprehensible and imaginable than the benefits are. Right now, we can imagine an AI. We've all seen enough science fiction movies killing or off an entire population. What is much harder to envision are all the benefits that can come out of that. I mean, if the benefits were obvious, the entrepreneurs would have already reduced them to practice and be selling products and services around them. Well, the fact is many, many entrepreneurial opportunities are being enabled by these AIs today. I could elaborate on them. I won't take the time right now to do so. But to balance the very visible and readily imaginable risk of AIs, we have to be extra deliberate in articulating the benefits, each and every one of us, and that takes thought. We need to replace risk assessment, which is all that letter is about, with cost-benefit analysis. There's no benefit discussed in that letter signed by all those luminaries at all. And we need that to have a more balanced discussion about this. So those are some thoughts.
I will tell you what the problem is. What is the only problem? Everything you have mentioned, fire, cell phone, lacks one critical thing, and that is value judgment. So if we use an AI to do things, that's fine. So if we teach an AI to drive a car, if we teach an AI to do a programming, if we teach an AI for anything, that's fine. I've chatted with GTP, and here's the problem with it. I've written and I've asked him, because out of the stuff he knows, about Captain America and about Punisher. So these are two Marvel characters. And I've asked him, is Captain America good or bad? And he gave me a huge answer. And then I said, no, answer yes or no. Is Captain America good? And he said yes. And then I asked him, is Punisher good or bad? Or good or evil? And he said, evil. So it already has the ability to create value judgment. If it gains power with or without consciousness to create value judgment on a society, then some people are going to be good and some people are going to be bad, which is the definition of a totalitarian system. So if we can create an AI without the possibility of a value judgment, where it is a tool, peachy. But if you have what you already have, an AI with a very clear set of values and ability to create value judgment, to be put into any kind of practice, thanks, but I've already seen the Terminator. I don't need to live through it. That's my problem with it. I don't know if we're going to go into that direction. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm sure you fully understand the difference between a tool, a highly intelligent tool, and something that has value judgment on another human being and a power to exercise that. That's a dangerous road to take.
Just a quick overview of sort of recent events, past 12 to 18 months, I thought would be interesting. Within that context, certainly, I mean, we've heard today that the Hungarian government has proven to be stable, so it's provided stability in Hungary, so winning landslide elections now for the fourth time in a row. And probably the key reason why this was successful is because the government truly, demonstrably tries to do what was discussed earlier, and that is to really represent in a very proactive way its own citizens, so the people of Hungary. And it always feels the need to do something. And it does that in a very consistent way. Now, it has done so, for the most part, in such a way that the key macroeconomic indicators have been pretty stable. So what are those indicators? So obviously employment, inflation, government deficit, monetary policy, interest rates, the currency, and so on. But something changed recently. And that's not good, obviously. And of course they changed elsewhere around the world as well, but they changed much more in Hungary than in other places. And the question is why? That's the interesting question that I'd like to just very briefly give some thought to. And probably the best sort of question to try to answer that Hungarians are wondering about is, why is Hungarian inflation much higher than any other country in our region? And it's not 1%, it's significantly higher. It's 25%, by the way. Wow. 25%. So the question is, why is that the case? I mean, that's a real extreme. When inflation was about the same as elsewhere in Europe, 3-4% 2 years ago. And there are a combination of reasons. Some of them are external, so they are exogenous, and though you cannot blame the government or policymakers. And we know of those. They are clearly, the Hungarian economy is probably one of the most, if not the most, open economies in the world. And it is also manufacturing based. And what that means is that it relies a whole lot on energy. And the problem is that Hungary doesn't have resources internally, energy resources internally. So it imports energy. And so when energy prices go up, as they did, gas prices, electricity, and all others, then the Hungarian economy was affected more than other countries where you have local resources, energy resources. So one of the sort of things to take away, and I think the Hungarian government certainly recognizes, looking back, is if the Hungarian government had reached its goal of expanding its nuclear plant in Paks, which it had planned to do by now, things would not have been nearly as bad as it was, or as is currently the case. And you know what? There is still no deadline as to when the new nuclear plant will actually be completed. It is nowhere in sight. So that's one external reason. The second external reason is the drought that Hungary and Europe faced last year. And just to give you a context, Hungary, as you know, has lots of land, lots of arable land, grows lots of grain, and in no time ever has Hungary been in a situation where it's had to import corn, ever. And it's to such an extent where millions of tons of corn had to be imported over the past 6 to 9 months. And again, you can imagine the effect on food prices. So those were the two external causes. The internal causes is really a combination of fiscal and monetary policy, which combined really had an overheating effect on the Hungarian economy. So the central bank had loose monetary policy, very low interest rates below inflation for a decade. And for a very long time, as in other countries, there was no increase in inflation and everyone thought everything would be fine. But of course, things weren't. And fiscal policy, same way, there was extra spending even after there was after COVID was over. Fiscal policy continued with very large deficits. And the combination of those, especially just before the election of last year, the election in Hungary took place 2 months or 6 weeks after the Ukrainian war started. And so that overheating combined with that external shock made a very negative cocktail. And then finally, the other thing that I just wanted to highlight and is a learning point is this constant feeling that the government needs to do something. And certainly it's trying to demonstrate that it's doing something to alleviate inflation. And so the government has actually put in place policies of capping basic goods like fuel and foodstuffs, basic eggs and chicken, milk, and so on. And it is now pretty evident that besides creating scarcity, right, and any cap on any good will drive commercial entities to not sell it. But even worse, obviously the retailers, what did they do? In order to compensate for the loss on some of these basic goods, they raised prices on all other goods even more. And so you had a negative inflation effect. And so all of these effects actually ended up putting a huge speculation against the Hungarian currency, the forint. And so essentially what happened is that the Hungarian foreign currency became a speculator's playground, where in order, it wasn't you, No. The Hungarian forint had to be defended after losing 20% within a couple of months of its value. It had to be defended by the central bank having to raise interest rates to levels much higher than its neighboring countries. And so now the central bank, of course, has now stopped that rut. And so the Hungarian currency is now very strong, but it's only strong because there are lots of speculators who are in for earning a very high interest rate that more than compensates for any potential FX losses. So that's briefly where Hungary is now. I do believe that just purely because of the basis effect, inflation will be coming down. And the reason I'm confident that inflation will come down is because it all depends on inflationary expectations. And if you compare inflationary expectations based on surveys, in October, everyone expected inflation to continue to go up. Consumers, producers, and everyone. And yesterday, the latest survey showed that very few people expect inflation to continue. In fact, most people, both consumers and producers, at the moment do not expect any price changes, if any, to actually be dropping. So I'm very confident that things will be stabilizing in the near future. Well, everyone, as you know, was very apprehensive about whether we will have enough gas to run our industries throughout the winter. And actually, we were very lucky because we've had a very, very mild winter, probably one of the mildest winters in recent times. And so much of the gas that was stored is still available, which is the good news. And you can imagine, and the problem, of course, that it was bought at a very expensive price. So probably at the peak when everyone, and this was one of the problems of the EU, where there was no coordination as to how all of the different local countries would be increasing their storage facilities with gas. So they all competed with each other, driving up the price of gas all at once. But that's not the case now. So everyone is working still independently, but I think much more rigorously to make sure that the risk doesn't arise next winter. But it's if all you need is a very, very severe winter, it would be the opposite of this past winter, and then things would be much more difficult. So there's a lot of apprehension, but I know that there is a lot of planning. Some of the planning can be done short-term, and some of it is long-term, just which requires a lot of investment and infrastructure.
Great. I think everyone has been tired out. We have the Magnificent Seven that I would like the audience to thank. Thank Melissa and thank the Danube. Good night.